Thank you very much for the introduction. Just to clarify that I am still a PhD student working on my PhD in economics. I'm going to share my screen now. Please confirm that you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I am presenting on behalf of a team of researchers who work collaboratively on this project, where we are aiming to generate an evidence and gap map on the consumption of industrial diets among adolescents in Ghana. And the emphasis really is on what the current evidence tells us. So the team is comprised of researchers from the University of Cape Town, University of Greenwich, University of Ghana, University of Development Studies in Ghana, as well as SOAS London. And I just want to acknowledge the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich as the funding agency for this particular piece of work. So I'm going to delve right into it because I know we've got about 10 minutes. Just to begin with a brief overview on the background, this is information that we are all very familiar with. We know that the nutrition transition has been evident in many countries in the global south, and Ghana included. We also know that there has been changes in this has manifested in the changes in diet structure. People are consuming more and more highly processed foods compared to traditional nutrient-dense staples. And as the previous, in the just concluded sessions, what we had was that we are witnessing the reduction in undernutrition rates, and at the same time, we're seeing an increase in overnutrition. In the case of Ghana, between 2003 and 2014, we saw a reduction in stunting prevalence from about 35% to 19% over that period. And but as mentioned, we are noting an increase in the prevalence of overnutrition. 2016 systematic review found that nearly half of adults in Ghana are either overweight or obese. What we know from the evidence and what the literature is showing is that overnutrition is more prevalent among females than males. It is more prevalent in urban areas than rural areas, and it has historically been higher in households with higher socioeconomic levels. But evidence is also suggesting that the rate of increase in overnutrition is faster among poorest households compared to the richest households. So a lot of the studies that look at overnutrition, the prevalence, as well as consumption of processed foods have been mainly focused on adults. And so what we were interested in doing was to assess the extent to which research that has been undertaken in Ghana on consumption of these ultra-processed foods have actually included adolescents. And so our research question really was, to what extent does the research on adolescents' dietary patterns and nutritional outcomes within the context of this changing food environments takes into account the complexity of the food systems framework? And within that, we were interested in finding out which food systems domains are included or excluded within this area of research, and which is the more prevalent level of analysis, either the macro level, meso level, and as well as the macro level. We drew, to generate our evidence and gap map, we drew on the Sustainable Food Systems Framework, which was developed by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. And so we looked at issues from food supply to consumer behaviors, to diet, as well as nutritional outcomes. And within this food supply, consumer behaviors, as well as diets, we obviously also focused on the food and environments. So we built our evidence and gap map drawing on other evidence and gap maps that have been generated within the food security space. Of particular one to note is the Imana one that's available on the website, and which really offered a good base through which we developed our evidence and gap map. So as I mentioned, we looked at various aspects of the food systems from the policy environment. We also looked at food availability, looking at food supply issues, food sources. We also looked at food environment dimensions such as affordability, convenience, desirability, but we also extended to also look at the other domains around food consumption, as well as nutritional and health outcomes. In addition to that, we also looked at the type of research methods that were employed in the studies. So we looked at whether they were quantitative or qualitative, for example. We looked at where the focus of the geographical focus was on, and so forth. So we tried to, within each study, what we did was to look at which for all of these different metrics, which ones have been covered by this by each and every study. So, and here are the results of our evidence and gap map. Just to say that to source the literature, our focus was on studies that were conducted between 2010 and 2021. And we sourced 3 main databases, Corpus, Webs of Science, as well as PubMed. In total, we identified 3,034 articles that we identified from these databases. Of course, we screened them. We excluded some of them based on an abstract review. And in the end, we are left with with 23 articles which fit within our search criteria, and which we now included in our evidence and gap map. Just to quickly say that we excluded a lot of these studies because they did not focus on adolescents. But in addition to that, what we found was that while there are a lot of studies around food consumption, a lot of them have not necessarily looked at processed foods. A lot of them focus on broad food groups. And so it's not easy to disaggregate which of this among those foods, whether they are processed or unprocessed and so forth. There's a lot of focus on adults, and that's why we excluded some of these studies. And then a lot of focus on food production and consumption around agricultural households. We've got some focus on food policies, but not necessarily on the links to industrial diets. So to respond to the first question on which is a more prevalent level of analysis, micro, meso, or macro, and what are the main methods and metrics that were used, we found that a lot of the studies that we came across that looked at, again, just a reminder that we're looking at studies on adolescents and specifically on industrial food, so processed food. And a lot of the studies were based on primary research, field work, data collection. A lot of the studies were quantitative, and a lot of them have been conducted in urban areas of Ghana. We found that when it comes to the measurement units, a lot of the unit of analysis for a lot of the studies were individual. In this case, it was the adolescent, and a lot of the studies were conducted within the school environment. The children were interviewed in their schools about their consumption or dietary behaviors, etc. Now going on to the food system domains that were included. And the research, what we found is that, and this is not surprising, we have a lot of studies that are looking at dietary patterns and behavior. So 21 out of 23 studies. We also found some studies looking at specifically focusing on the points of consumption. Is it at home? Is it at school, etc.? And often this would link up to the types of foods that children were either procuring or consuming. We did find quite a number of studies on affordability, looking at the affordability domain, but even this was restricted to looking at income, as well as looking at income and socioeconomic status and wealth indices as measures of socioeconomic status, and trying to link them up with nutritional outcomes. But from the macro perspective, looking at food domains such as food policy and governance, we find very few studies on this end on this aspect of food systems domains. And then narrowing down to food environment, so looking at food supply and access, as well as affordability, convenience, and desirability. What we find is that the studies that the most common theme was actually affordability. And within this, it was more around income and socioeconomic status, looking at the income levels, socioeconomic status of these children or their households, as opposed to looking at food prices, for example. So what we found surprising is that we hardly found any study that looked at the industrial foods that adolescents consumed and the links to affordability, specifically food prices. We also found very few studies on food supply. Then I'm going to move on now to the number of studies that focused particularly on the food consumption domain. We found that a lot of this was the most popular domain that's coming across in many of the studies. And we found that the most common amongst this was on dietary intake. So looking at what types of foods were consumed by these children and so forth. But even within that, the types of foods and the number of foods that were included in these studies varied significantly across studies. So you find one study looking at one food, probably specifically fizzy drinks, and you find another study with a broader number of food items. So now that you're talking about food, there's a question on which industrial foods are the most common. And what we found was for all the studies that we looked at, these were the most common. So the foods with the larger font sizes were the most common. So those are the fizzy drinks, your sugars, your sweets, your juices, and so forth. The fried foods, processed pastries, cakes, and biscuits were also common, but generally the interest seems to be more around consumption of sweetened beverages. Finally, we also looked at where we had cases of overlapping themes, like the extent to which studies included more than one domain, and then a question of which domains were included. So what we found was that there's a very high correlation within domains that are covered the same sort of level of analysis. So we had high correlation of studies. What we saw was that studies that were looking at macro levels issues such as food policy were also looking at food supply issues, and studies that were looking at micro level issues such as nutritional outcomes were also looking at food consumption issues among these adolescents. So we find a very high correlation, and what we observe, within this macro, meso, micro levels, but what we observe is that a lot of studies are not really doing research that spans across the different levels of analysis. So in conclusion, we find that some domains are strikingly lacking in literature. So literature is lacking around food policies, particularly in relation to healthy eating among adolescents. Surprisingly, consumer knowledge and awareness is something that was also lacking. There are a lot of studies on that, but they specifically focus on adults and not necessarily on children and adolescents. And then, what we found also was that, which is very important, is that there are hardly any studies that are looking at the cost of food and links to adolescent food consumption. And finally, we still feel like there's a bit of work to be done within the desirability domain. So while there are some studies that have looked at obesogenic food environments, not a lot of them are focusing within the adolescent age group. So thank you very much. I know I'm 2 minutes over time. I apologize for that, but thank you very much. And I'd like to also recognize my colleague, my co-authors who are here, Fiorella, Chris, Peter, Paul, and Emmanuel. Thank you very much.